What's up, everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. Iran's new supreme leader just formally rebuilt the top of his own military, 6 new senior commanders across the armed forces, the IRGC and the Basij, all in one day. And the timing, issued in English on X at the exact moment Iranian and Omani negotiators are finalizing a shipping route through Hormuz, has one counterterrorism expert calling this a deliberate signal that Tehran is preparing for a prolonged confrontation, not a settlement. Let's break down exactly who got appointed, why this reshuffle had to happen in the first place, and what the timing actually tells you. I'll walk through the actual appointments and who's now running Iran's military, then why this reshuffle was even necessary given what's happened to the previous leadership, then the genuinely bizarre subplot about Khamenei's own health and public absence, then the expert analysis on why the timing matters, and finish with my take on what a freshly rebuilt command structure signals about Iran's actual intentions right now. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei signed 6 separate decrees Monday, and the full picture is genuinely comprehensive. Ali Abdullahi, previously head of Iran's Joint War Command and former commander of the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, the unified command structure I've covered in earlier videos, was named Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, one of the single most powerful military roles in the country. Omar Haidari, former Army Ground Forces commander, was named as deputy. Ahmad Vahidi was promoted to Major General and confirmed as Commander-in-Chief of the IRGC, officially succeeding Mohammad Pakpour, who was killed during the opening salvo of this war back in February. Mustafa Izzadi, former commander of the Cyber and New Threats Headquarters, was named Deputy IRGC Commander. Ali Azmai was appointed Commander of the IRGC Navy, and Hossein Teb was named Head of the Basij Resistance Force. Separately, and just as significantly, Mohsen Rezaee, who commanded the IRGC for 16 years, including during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, was named Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, Khamenei's own representative on the country's top decision-making body, replacing Mohammad Bakr Zolgadar. That's 7 senior appointments total across a single 48-hour window, essentially a complete reconstruction of Iran's wartime command structure at once. This reshuffle isn't really optional housekeeping. It's Iran rebuilding after genuinely devastating losses at the top of its military and political leadership. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, supreme leader since 1989, was killed in the February 28th strike that opened this entire war. Ali Larijani, then Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, and Gholamreza Soleimani, commander of the Basij, were both killed in strikes on March 17th. Mohammad Pakpour, the IRGC's own commander-in-chief, was killed in that same opening salvo. That's the country's supreme leader, its top national security official, its Basij commander, and its IRGC commander, all killed within about 3 weeks of this war starting. For months after those losses, Iran International's reporting notes the wartime leadership structure operated without formal decrees filling several of these posts, meaning Iran has genuinely been fighting this war for nearly half a year with major gaps in its own formal military hierarchy. This reshuffle is Tehran finally formally closing those gaps, though notably not all of them. More on that in a second. Iran International's own reporting flagged something worth including here. This reshuffle still doesn't resolve 2 major cabinet-level vacancies. The Defense Ministry remains under an acting minister, Majid Ibn al-Reza, appointed after the previous minister was killed on February 28th, but never formally nominated as permanent. The Intelligence Ministry has had no permanent minister since Esmail Khatib was killed in March. And remarkably, Iran's government has never even publicly disclosed who's currently serving as acting minister in that role. That's a genuinely unusual level of opacity, even for a government mid-war. And it tells you Iran's leadership rebuild is still very much a work in progress, rather than a fully completed picture. I want to bring in something genuinely strange running alongside all of this. President Masoud Pezeshkian claimed Monday that he'd held a nearly 7-hour meeting with Khamenei, only the second such meeting he's publicly disclosed since Khamenei became supreme leader, and said Khamenei is completely healthy. That statement exists specifically to counter ongoing speculation, which I've touched on in earlier videos, about whether Khamenei was seriously injured in the same February 28th strike that killed his father. Al Jazeera reports an official with the Basij paramilitary organization said state media will soon release new pictures of Khamenei, taken after the war, specifically to disprove claims he may have been badly wounded. And that state-linked Mer News actually recirculated old, undated video of him this week rather than new footage, which, if anything, raises more questions than it answers about why fresh footage isn't available. This is the detail that actually elevates this story beyond a routine personnel announcement. Dr. Omar Mohammed, director of the Anti-Semitism Research Initiative at George Washington University's program on extremism, told Fox News Digital the sequencing here is deliberate. These announcements went out in English on X at the exact moment Iranian and Omani negotiators are finalizing the coordinates of a proposed shipping route through Hormuz, the exact negotiation I covered in my last video on this war. His read is that Tehran is signaling it's preparing for prolonged confrontation, not a settlement with Washington. That's worth sitting with given everything I covered about the genuine optimism around those Hormuz talks. Publicizing a full wartime military reconstruction, in English for an international audience, at the precise moment diplomats are reportedly making real progress on reopening the strait, is either a coincidence or a calculated signal that Iran wants both tracks running simultaneously, talk peace with one hand while visibly rebuilding warfighting capacity with the other. Before going further, it's worth explaining how these different bodies actually relate to each other, because Iran's military isn't organized the way most people assume. Iran effectively runs parallel military structures, the regular Artesh, the conventional army, navy, and air force, and the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, which operates as an entirely separate, ideologically vetted force with its own ground, air, and naval branches, answerable directly to the Supreme Leader, rather than through the normal chain of command. The Armed Forces General Staff, now headed by Abdullahi, is supposed to coordinate across both of these parallel structures, while the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, which I've covered extensively in earlier videos on this war as Iran's unified wartime command, sits above both in theory during active conflict. That's exactly why Abdullahi's specific background matters so much for understanding this appointment. He previously ran Khatam al-Anbiya itself, meaning he's stepping into the top armed forces role with direct, recent experience actually coordinating across these parallel military structures during wartime, rather than coming from a purely conventional Artesh or purely IRGC background. Given how much this war has stressed exactly that kind of cross-structure coordination, missile forces, naval assets, and IRGC ground units all needing to respond to a fast-moving multi-front conflict simultaneously, having someone with that specific unified command experience in the top overall military post is a meaningful signal about what kind of coordination challenges Iran's leadership expects to keep facing going forward. I also want to explain why the Basij commander appointment matters beyond just filling a vacant seat. The Basij is a paramilitary volunteer force, historically used both for domestic security and crowd control, and as a mobilization pool that can be rapidly expanded during wartime, tracing back to its massive human wave role during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. Given everything I covered in my earlier video on Iran's domestic economic crisis and protest movement, bazaar strikes, currency collapse, broad-based unrest, the Basij's domestic security function is arguably just as relevant to this specific appointment as any external warfighting consideration. Hossein Tib, the new Basij commander, previously ran IRGC intelligence for years before being replaced in that role back in 2022, giving him a genuinely unusual background combining internal security and intelligence experience specifically. Appointing someone with that specific profile to head the Basij at a moment when Iran is simultaneously managing external war, and the kind of domestic unrest I documented in my earlier video, suggests this appointment may be as much about ensuring internal control and crackdown capacity as it is about external wartime mobilization. That's worth remembering, given how directly it connects the military reshuffle covered in this video to the entirely separate economic and protest crisis I've covered elsewhere in this series. These aren't actually separate stories, they're two fronts. The same reconstructed command structure now has to manage simultaneously. I want to spend more time on the Rezaee appointment specifically, because I think it's actually more consequential than any of the 6 military decrees on their own. Rezaee isn't just a veteran commander. He's one of the most recognizable political and military figures in the Islamic Republic's entire history, having led the IRGC for 16 years, including through the brutal, formative Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, and having run for president multiple times in subsequent decades, positioning himself over the years as a kind of elder statesman bridging the military and political establishment, placing someone with that specific stature and that specific historical weight into the role of Khamenei's own representative on the Supreme National Security Council, the body responsible for the country's most sensitive security and foreign policy decisions, tells you Iran's new, relatively untested Supreme Leader is leaning heavily on proven old guard credibility to help steady this specific decision-making body during an active war. That's a meaningfully different signal than simply promoting a younger, less established figure into that same role. Given everything I've covered about Mojtaba Khamenei's own limited public presence and the ongoing questions about his health and standing, having a figure like Rezaee, with decades of unquestioned revolutionary and military credibility, sitting at his side on national security matters, likely serves a stabilizing function for the regime's own internal legitimacy, not just a practical staffing decision. I touched on the health subplot earlier, but I think it deserves more attention because of how directly it ties back into everything else in this video. A supreme leader who's barely been seen publicly since taking power in March, whose own government felt compelled to publicly assert he's completely healthy after a 7-hour meeting, and whose state media apparently had to recirculate old, undated footage rather than release fresh video specifically meant to disprove injury claims, is operating from a genuinely unusual position of diminished public visibility for a head of state in the middle of an active war. That context actually reframes how you should read this entire military reshuffle. A leader with uncertain public standing and persistent health speculation swirling around him has real incentive to demonstrate decisive, visible command authority through exactly this kind of comprehensive, formally announced leadership reconstruction. Filling 6 senior military posts, plus the top national security advisory role in a single, well-publicized 48-hour window, is precisely the kind of action that projects strength and control, regardless of whatever the actual underlying truth about Khamenei's health and day-to-day involvement turns out to be. I'm not in a position to verify claims about his physical condition one way or another, but I think it's worth understanding this reshuffle as serving double duty, both genuine wartime military necessity and a visible demonstration of continued command authority, at a moment when that authority has been publicly questioned. I want to come back to something I flagged earlier and give it the attention I think it deserves, because out of everything left unresolved in this reshuffle, the intelligence ministry vacancy is the one that genuinely surprised me most. Iran's government has apparently never publicly disclosed who's serving as acting minister there, even though Esmail Khatib was killed all the way back in March. That's not a minor administrative gap. The intelligence ministry sits at the center of counter-espionage, internal security, and foreign intelligence operations. Exactly the kind of function you'd expect any government to prioritize, filling quickly and visibly during an active war, if only to reassure its own security services and allied intelligence partners that a clear chain of command exists. The fact that this specific post remains publicly unfilled, even while 6 other senior military positions just got a full, formal, internationally publicized announcement, suggests something more deliberate than simple bureaucratic delay. It's possible Iran's leadership views public identification of its intelligence chief as itself a security risk worth avoiding, especially given how effectively US and Israeli intelligence services have apparently been able to track and target senior Iranian officials throughout this entire war. The strikes that killed the previous Supreme Leader, the SNSC Secretary, the Basij commander, and the IRGC commander all suggest a genuinely sophisticated targeting capability against exactly this category of senior official. Keeping the identity of the current intelligence chief unpublished could very plausibly be a deliberate operational security decision rather than an oversight, protecting that specific individual from becoming the next name on that same list. I think it's worth placing this reshuffle in some historical context, because Iran has restructured its military leadership during moments of crisis before, and the comparison is instructive. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the period several of these newly appointed commanders, including Rezaee himself, actually served in, Iran went through multiple rounds of leadership consolidation and reorganization as the conflict ground on for 8 brutal years, gradually shifting toward more centralized, more experienced command structures as the war matured and the initial revolutionary chaos of the early Islamic Republic gave way to a more institutionalized wartime governance model. There's a real echo of that historical pattern in what's happening right now. This war opened with catastrophic, decapitating losses at the very top of Iran's leadership within its first 3 weeks, an initial period of genuine chaos and improvisation, similar in some ways to the early, disorganized phase of that earlier war before Iran's revolutionary government had fully consolidated wartime control. This reshuffle, coming nearly 6 months in, reads like Iran's leadership finally completing the same kind of institutional consolidation process that took considerably longer to develop during the Iran-Iraq War, likely accelerated this time by the sheer scale and speed of the initial leadership losses, forcing faster adaptation than that earlier, more gradual conflict required. Whether that faster consolidation actually translates into more effective wartime command and control going forward, or whether it's simply formalizing structures that have already been operating informally for months, as Iran International's reporting suggests, is something I'll be watching closely as this war continues. I want to dig deeper into this specific detail Dr. Mohammed flagged, because I don't think a single sentence does it justice. Iranian government communications have historically operated through multiple, deliberately distinct channels depending on the intended audience, state television and Farsi language outlets like IRNA and MER for domestic consumption, and separate, carefully curated English language channels, specifically when the message is meant for international governments, foreign media, and diplomatic observers. Choosing to announce a major wartime military reconstruction specifically in English on a Western social media platform, rather than solely through domestic Iranian channels, is a deliberate choice about audience. And it tells you this message was crafted at least as much for Washington's benefit as for any domestic Iranian purpose. That's exactly why the timing against the Hormuz negotiations matters so much. If Iran genuinely only wanted to communicate this reshuffle to its own population and its own military apparatus, Farsi language state media would have been the obvious, sufficient channel. Choosing English and X specifically suggests Iran wanted American negotiators and the broader international audience watching this war closely, including everyone who's been following my own coverage of the Hormuz talks, to see this reshuffle clearly and understand its implications in real time, right as those negotiators are reportedly finalizing actual shipping route coordinates. That's about as close to a deliberate, calculated diplomatic signal as a military personnel announcement can get. I want to connect this directly back to everything I covered in my last video on the reported progress in Muscat. I flagged real caution there already, noting that Iran's Navy was still turning back ships on unapproved routes even while diplomats reported progress, and Mattis's warning about what happens if this crisis gets declared resolved prematurely. This reshuffle adds another layer of caution to that same picture. A government that's simultaneously sending its negotiators to finalize technical details on reopening a critical waterway, while publicly, deliberately broadcasting a complete wartime military reconstruction in the language and on the platform most likely to be seen by the exact governments it's negotiating with, is sending two different messages at once, and I don't think you can fully trust either one in isolation. It's entirely possible both messages are genuine and simply reflect different tracks of the same overall strategy, rebuild military credibility and negotiating leverage simultaneously, rather than choosing between diplomacy and continued confrontation. Governments negotiate from positions of strength all the time, and a freshly reconstructed, fully staffed command structure arguably gives Iran's negotiators more credibility and more internal authority to actually deliver on whatever they agree to in Muscat, precisely because the military chain of command enforcing that agreement is now more clearly defined than it's been at any point since this war started. But it's equally possible, exactly as Dr. Mohammed suggested, that this is Tehran hedging, or even signaling its true intentions, while running out the clock on talks it doesn't fully intend to honor, similar to the pattern I've now documented multiple times throughout this war of Iran's diplomatic and military tracks, not always appearing to move in the same direction. I think this reshuffle tells you two things at once. First, practically, Iran genuinely needed this. You cannot run a modern military for nearly 6 months with your chief of staff position, your IRGC commander, and your National Security Council secretary, all either dead or informally filled. This was overdue basic functionality, and the specific choice of Abdullahi with his direct Khatam al-Anbiya experience, and Rezaee with his decades of unquestioned revolutionary credibility, both suggest a genuine, considered effort to rebuild functional wartime command, rather than a rushed or purely symbolic exercise. But the deliberate English language, X-platform timing, landing right on top of the Hormuz negotiations, reads exactly the way Dr. Mohammed describes it, a message aimed as much at Washington and international observers as at Iran's own military. I don't think this necessarily dooms the Hormuz talks I covered in my last video, but it's a genuine reason for caution rather than assuming this crisis is anywhere near fully resolved. I'd also flag the still unfilled intelligence ministry post as worth watching closely if that specific position does eventually get filled and publicly announced, especially if it happens through the same kind of deliberate, internationally facing messaging as this reshuffle. That would tell you Iran's leadership has grown more confident in its own security posture. If it stays unfilled and unpublished indefinitely, that tells you something rather different about how seriously Tehran still takes the risk of losing yet another senior official to exactly the kind of targeted strikes that have already claimed so much of its original wartime leadership. So that's the story. Iran's Supreme Leader formally rebuilding his entire top military command in a single day. 7 senior appointments closing gaps left by months of devastating strikes on Iran's own leadership. 2 cabinet posts still conspicuously unfilled. A strange ongoing health subplot around Khamenei himself, and timing that experts are reading as a deliberate signal of prolonged confrontation rather than settlement. Layer in the historical echo of Iran's own Iran-Iraq war leadership consolidation, the specific backgrounds of figures like Abdullahi and Rezaee, and the genuinely deliberate choice to broadcast this reshuffle in English at the exact moment Hormuz negotiators are finalizing shipping routes. And I think this is one of the more strategically layered developments I've covered in this entire war, even though on the surface it's just a personnel announcement. I'll keep tracking how this intersects with the Hormuz talks I covered in my last video, and I'll be watching closely for any movement on that still vacant intelligence ministry post, as a signal of how Iran's own confidence in its security posture is evolving. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe for the next update. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.